The alarm hit at 3:47, and Instructor Davin Kale was already awake. He'd been lying on his back in the narrow bunk of the faculty residence, listening to the ventilation hum, running through tomorrow's simulation schedule in his head. When the facility-wide klaxon punched through the walls, 3 short bursts, the intruder code, he was already pulling on his boots before the second cycle finished. He grabbed his ID badge, his access card, and the emergency radio clipped to the door frame out of habit. 12 years working in education at the Cooperative Academy for Interspecies Development will do that to you. You learn to sleep light. You learn to move fast. You learn that most alarms are false, and a few of them are the kind that end careers. This one, he suspected, was somewhere in the middle. The corridors of the Academy's residential block were flooded with yellow emergency light. He could hear the security team moving on the floor above, heavy boots, the crackle of radio chatter, someone calling out sector designations in the clipped shorthand that security staff used when they were trying not to sound alarmed while clearly being alarmed. He stepped into the main hallway and found his colleague Petra Oren rushing toward him from the opposite direction, her gray faculty braid half undone, a datapad in her hand. "What is it?" he asked. "Someone triggered the unauthorized entry sensor in Learning Suite 7, she said, falling into step beside him. "Motion inside, no ID signal. Security is treating it as an infiltration. Suite 7 is the early childhood block." "I know." They both moved faster. The Cooperative Academy sat on the neutral station of Juncture 4, midway between human-occupied space and the Veth Conclave's home systems. It was, depending on who you asked, either the most important diplomatic institution in the current era or the most optimistic. Its mandate was blunt: take the children of both species, human and Veth, and raise them in proximity to each other before the cultural calcification set in. The theory was that children who had grown up sharing classrooms, meals, and games would carry that knowledge into their adult lives, into diplomacy, into commerce, into the slow work of not going to war. The theory was working, more or less. The academy had been running for 9 years. Its graduates were already in embassies, in trade offices, in research stations. Davin Kale had been teaching here for 6 of those 9 years, Advanced Cooperation Seminar, which was less glamorous than it sounded and mostly involved mediating arguments about whose team had cheated at zero-gravity tag. But tonight, something was in Suite 7 that wasn't supposed to be there. Security reached the door first. Davin and Petra arrived at the corridor junction just as the 2-person team was stacking up outside, armor, visors, the low-energy stun configurations that were Academy policy for child-adjacent zones. Protocol. He appreciated that someone had thought through the protocol. The team leader, a compact woman named Joss, held up a fist when she saw him. "Instructors, hold position." "What's the read?" Davin asked. "Motion sensor caught 3 separate signals about 20 minutes ago, moving in from the external crawlspace access, which, for the record, was not supposed to be able to open." She glanced at her partner. "They've gone static since, huddled together in the far corner near the reading cushions." 3 signals, Petra said. "How large?" Joss looked at her sensor display. "Small, very small." Davin and Petra looked at each other. "Children," Davin said. "It wasn't a question." "Possibly, we don't know species or condition. Could be a distraction or a lead. We follow protocol." But Joss said it in the tone of someone who was also thinking, "Children." She nodded to her partner. He keyed the door. The lights inside Suite 7 were off except for the ambient safety strips along the baseboards, which threw a pale blue glow across the low furniture. The reading tables sized for small bodies, the cushioned floor segments in yellow and green, the shelves full of physical books and tactile learning objects that the Academy still used because both Veth and human children turned out to respond better to things they could hold. The projector on the ceiling was dark. The interactive display wall was powered down. In the far corner, in the nest of large floor cushions that the children called the den, 3 small shapes were pressed together. Joss moved in first, angling left, her partner right. Davin followed without being asked. He stepped past the reading tables, past the low bookshelf with the hand-painted spine labels, past the bin of shared drawing tools, and he saw them. Veth cubs, 3 of them. The smallest couldn't have been more than 3 years old, the largest perhaps 5. They were curled together like a pile of sleeping dogs, limbs overlapping, the 2 older ones positioned with their bodies bracketing the smallest. Protective, automatic, the kind of arrangement that didn't need to be decided. Veth were not, in the broad sense, alarming to look at. Not anymore, not to anyone who'd been at the academy for more than a season. They were bipedal, roughly humanoid in silhouette, but their skin was a soft gray-green that shifted toward silver near the face. Their eyes were large and pale, set wide in features that gave them an expression of perpetual attentiveness. Their fingers were longer than a human child's, their ears slightly mobile, their noses flat and wide. They had a faint bioluminescent tracing along their temple lines that brightened when they were afraid or excited. A biological tell that the Academy's human children had learned to read almost as naturally as a human blush. All 3 cubs had those temple lines blazing. The oldest, the one on the left edge of the pile, had its eyes open, fixed on Joss, fixed on the armor, the visor, the stun configuration in her hands. The cub's arms were wrapped around the 2 smaller ones, and it was very, very still in the way that small creatures went still when they had decided that not moving was the only option left. Davin stepped around Joss. He didn't ask permission. He moved to the side, away from the line of security, and he crouched down so that he was below eye level, a technique the Academy had taught every instructor as the first move in any high-stress encounter with a child, any species. He put his hands flat on the floor in front of him, palms up, fingers open. The Veth greeting configuration for non-threat. He'd learned it in his first month. "Hey," he said quietly, "you're okay. Nobody's going to hurt you." The oldest cub's pale eyes moved from Joss to him. The temple lines flickered. "My name is Instructor Kale. I work here. This room," he glanced around, "this is where the little ones have story time. I bet you knew that already. That's why you came here, isn't it?" Nothing, but the youngest cub, the one in the middle, stirred slightly at the sound of his voice. A small hand emerged from the pile and made a fist, then opened again. "Joss," Davin said, without looking away from the cubs, "can you and your partner wait in the corridor?" A pause. "Protocol says." "These are 3 frightened children. Protocol also says we de-escalate. You've done that. The room is clear and contained. I'd like to try talking to them." Another pause, shorter. "Radio stays on. You call if anything changes." "Agreed." He heard them retreat. Heard the door stay open. Of course it did, visibility. But the heavy presence of armor and equipment moved back. The quality of the room changed. The oldest cub was still watching him. After a moment it made a sound, a low, clicking trill at the back of its throat, and the middle cub's head came up. 2 pale eyes blinked at Davin. "There you are," he said gently. The middle cub looked at him for a long moment. Then it looked at the oldest cub. The oldest made the click trill again, something that read as reassurance. Davin stayed exactly where he was, hands on the floor. He'd learned a long time ago that the hardest thing about working with frightened children, any children, was the human instinct to move toward them, to reach out, to close distance. It felt like comfort from the inside. From the outside, to a small being that had already decided the world was dangerous, it felt like an approaching threat. So he waited. Petra arrived at the door behind him. He heard her stop and, without being asked, hold position. Good. 5 minutes passed, maybe more, he didn't check. The middle cub finally unwound itself from the pile. It sat up, took in the room with those wide, pale eyes, and then, with the solemn deliberateness of a very small person making a very large decision, it walked toward Davin. It stopped about an arm's length away, looked at him. He looked back. The cub lifted one hand and placed its longer fingers against the back of his upturned palm. A light touch, testing. "Hi," Davin said. The cub's temple lines pulsed once, warm gold instead of the frightened blue-white. A color shift that every academy instructor learned to read as the Veth equivalent of a small, uncertain smile. He kept very still. The cub kept its fingers on his palm. The oldest cub watched from the cushions, arms still around the smallest, who had fallen back asleep. It took another 10 minutes before Davin got the full picture, and he got it in pieces, from what the middle cub communicated through gesture, and the few words of shared academy Creole it had clearly learned from somewhere, from what the oldest eventually said in halting but functional Veth standard, and from the evidence visible on all three of them once the light was better. The condition of their clothes, the way the smallest one's breathing caught and hitched even in sleep, the old bruises on the oldest cub's arms that had nothing to do with a fall. They had come from a Veth vessel in the docking ring. The vessel had been in berth for 4 days. Davin would find out later that the vessel was registered as a transport courier, running between Juncture 4 and the outer conclave stations, and that its captain had filed no passenger manifest. He would find out later that the cubs had been brought aboard on what the outer station Veth called a ghost transit, children who didn't exist on paper, moving through systems without documentation, ending up in places that didn't ask about provenance. He would find out all of that later. What he knew right now, crouched on the floor of Suite 7 with the middle cub's fingers still resting on his palm, was simpler and worse. These three had been on that ship for at least 3 weeks. They had come to the academy because the oldest had seen it from a viewport, had recognized the shared species emblem on the station signage, and had decided that a place where Veth children went to school was a better option than what they had. The oldest cub, whose name translated roughly as something like Keth, was 4.5 years old. Keth had gotten the crawlspace access open with a tool it had taken from the ship's maintenance locker and hidden in the lining of its jacket. Davin sat back on his heels and breathed. "Okay," he said, as much to himself as to anyone. "Okay." The academy's response infrastructure kicked in before dawn. By the time the sky outside the station's observation windows shifted from the simulated deep blue of night cycle to the pale gray of morning, 3 things had happened. The medical team had cleared all 3 cubs. The smallest, who was a girl whose name sounded like Essa, had a respiratory infection that was manageable but needed treatment, and Keth had 2 old injuries, wrist and shoulder, that had healed without proper setting. The Academy's interspecies welfare officer had been pulled from her bunk and was now sitting in a conference room with 2 very tired security staffers and a datapad full of questions. And Davin Kale was sitting in the medical bay on a chair that was not designed for extended sitting, because someone had to be there and nobody had told him to leave. He wasn't S's instructor. He wasn't assigned to any of them. He was advanced cooperation seminar. But Essa had fallen asleep against his arm in the transport cart between Suite 7 and the medical bay, and he'd carried her the last 30 meters because the cart's vibration had started to make her cough, and it seemed wrong to put her down on a cold surface when they arrived. And then the medical team had gotten to work, and the natural moment to leave had somehow never appeared. Keth and the middle cub, whose name was rendered in Veth standard as something that the translator kept spitting out as mere, and so mere it was, were in the adjacent bay, visible through the transparent partition. Keth had not slept. Keth was sitting upright in the bed with Mir curled asleep against its side and both of them tucked under the thermal sheet, and Keth's pale eyes were fixed on the partition, on Essa, in a way that Davin recognized. He'd seen that look before, not in cubs, in older kids, in students who had come to the academy from complicated backgrounds, children who had learned early that the adults around them were not to be trusted with the people they loved. That look said, "I am the one watching. I don't sleep until I know everyone is safe." It was 4 years old. Davin pulled his chair until he was directly in Keth's line of sight. He sat so the cub could see him clearly. He pointed to Essa, then to himself, then made the open hand gesture. "I've got her." Keth stared at him. Davin kept the gesture steady, didn't break eye contact, didn't look away. The cub's temple lines moved through a complicated series of colors. The interrogative amber, the watchful steel blue, then something slower and quieter that the Academy's Veth culture instructors called the considering color, the pale green that meant the cub was weighing something large. Keth looked at Essa, looked at Davin, looked at Mir asleep against its side. Then slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone putting down something heavy they'd been carrying a long time, Keth leaned sideways and tucked its head against Mir's, and its eyes closed. Davin exhaled. He sat there until morning. The welfare review process was, in the official sense, not his domain. He knew this. He was an instructor in advanced cooperation seminar for 11 to 13-year-olds. He was not a welfare officer, not a counselor, not a licensed Veth standards advocate. He was a person who had accidentally become the individual these three cubs associated with safety, and the Academy's administration, with the pragmatism of people who had been running an interspecies institution for 9 years, had decided this was a resource, not a complication. "You have a rapport," said Director Havin, who ran the Academy's operational side with the energy of someone who had long ago accepted that her institution was going to present her with situations that no manual had anticipated. "Use it. Sit in on the intake interviews if the cubs seem more stable with you there. We'll have the welfare office lead, but your presence may help. I'm not trained for welfare interviews." "I know, don't conduct it, just sit there." He sat there. The welfare officer was a Veth human dual qualified specialist named Ondev, one of the Academy's permanent staff, a calm and methodical woman who ran the sessions with the careful patience of someone who had done this many times and never let that show. She interviewed Keth first, through a Veth interpreter, and Davin sat against the wall behind Keth's line of sight, where the cub could see him without having to turn away from Ondev. Keth spoke more than Davin expected. He didn't understand most of it. His Veth standard was functional but not conversational. The interpreter worked quietly in his earpiece. What he caught in fragments was the shape of the thing, a caretaker who had left, a ship that had taken them on, conditions that were not good, 3 weeks on the vessel, the emblem in the viewport. What he heard in the pauses was harder. Ondev guided the interview with skill. She never pushed at the pauses. She followed Keth's pace, let silences breathe, came back to things obliquely. When she finally said, through the interpreter, gently, "Can you tell me about the person who was supposed to be looking after you before the ship?" Keth went still. Then the cub looked past Ondev, directly at Davin. He didn't move, held the open hand configuration. Keth said one word in Veth standard. The interpreter said, "Gone." The formal process took 10 days. In that time, Davin learned several things he hadn't known before. He learned that the Academy had, in fact, a contingency framework for exactly this type of situation. Undocumented Veth cubs on station without a guardian, because the 9 years of operation had produced several precedents, and someone had had the foresight to write them down. He learned that the conclave's nearest administrative station was 17 hours away by fast courier, and that their representative, once contacted, was cooperative but slow-moving in the particular way of bureaucracies that had very clear processes for situations they'd seen before, and very unclear processes for everything else. He learned that Essa's respiratory infection cleared fully within 5 days, and that, when she was well enough to come to the common area, She walked directly to him and held up her arms. He picked her up. There didn't seem to be another option. He learned that Mir was, by Veth developmental reckoning, 4 years old, extremely stubborn, and had somehow already formed an opinion about the yellow drawing tools in Suite 7, specifically that they were the correct tools and the blue ones were inferior, which Davin discovered when Mir staged a 20-minute refusal to use the provided materials during a supervised arts session, and would not be moved until Davin found the yellow ones. "You realize," Petra said, watching him search a supply closet, "that you have completely abandoned any pretense of this being temporary. I'm just helping with the transition. You've eaten dinner with them 4 nights in a row. The dining hall has good food." Davin. He found the yellow drawing tools. He did not answer her. He learned this was the hard one, the one he turned over in his head for several days, that Keth slept best when the door of the temporary residence room was open and Davin's light was visible in the corridor. Not because Keth needed Davin, because Keth needed to be able to see that the hallway was not empty, that there was someone in it. He'd asked the night shift attendant to note if Keth woke, and on the 3rd night the attendant had messaged him at 200, "The older one is up, looking at the door." He'd walked down in his socks and sat in the corridor with a book until Keth's light went out. He did it the next 3 nights without being asked. On the 11th day, the conclave's representative, a middle-aged official named Harv Solith, which was not a Veth name and which turned out to be the official's chosen interface designation, a common practice for Veth who worked extensively with humans, arrived on a transit shuttle and sat down with Ondev and Director Haven and 2 representatives from the Academy's legal framework team. Davin was not in that meeting. He knew this was appropriate. He sat in the corridor outside with Mir on his knee. Mir had decided that his knee was an acceptable chair, and this had not been negotiated, and read from a physical book with the words turned so that Mir could also see the illustrations, which Mir regarded with the critical attention of a connoisseur. Ondev came out an hour and 40 minutes later. She sat down beside him, looked at Mir. "The representative is willing to open a formal care review," she said. "The conclave's position is that the Cubs' situation qualifies them for emergency conclave ward status, which means their care can be formally assigned while a long-term placement is determined." "How long is determined?" "Months, possibly longer. The precedent cases suggest 6 to 18 months for formal placement in a Veth family unit, assuming a suitable match is found." She paused. "They have no surviving documented family. That complicates placement." Davin looked at the book in his hands. Mir turned a page without asking. "The placement would be with a Veth family." "That's the standard, yes." Ondav's voice was careful. "Human family placement for Veth Cubs is possible in exceptional circumstances, but it would require a significant case to be made." "I'm not," he stopped, started again. "I'm not suggesting anything." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "The representative would like to speak with you, though, separately. He found it significant that the Cubs came to the Academy specifically. He has some questions. About the facility. About you." Mir, apparently bored with the conversation, climbed off his knee and went to look at something on the floor near the wall. Davin watched the cub go and then looked at Ondev. "What kind of questions?" "I think you should ask him that yourself." Harv Solith was a compact man, human passing in the way of Veth who had spent enough years in mixed environments that their physiological tells had quieted to the background. He had the wide pale eyes and the slight temple tracing, but they were subtle. If you weren't looking, you might not notice. He drank his tea in a way that was extremely human and looked at Davin across the conference table with an expression that was extremely Veth in its directness. "You were the first human Keth trusted," he said. "It was not a question." "I was the first human Keth tested," Davin said. "I think there's a difference." Solith considered this. How so? Keth didn't trust me. Keth decided I was probably not going to make things worse. That's a different calculation. I think, he paused. I think Keth is very good at that calculation. Whatever they went through, it taught Keth to be a very careful assessor of situations. 4 years old. Yes. Solith set down his tea. The Academy's records show that you've had continuous contact with all 3 cubs since the night of their arrival, more than any other staff member. I happened to be available that night. You've been available every night since. Davin didn't answer. Instructor Kale. Solith's voice was even, not unkind. I've worked in conclave child welfare for 22 years. I've seen the full range of how adults respond to children who arrive in circumstances like these. Some are efficient, some are moved, some become involved in the technical sense but keep appropriate distance. And some, he paused, some find that they cannot not be there. That distance doesn't occur to them as an option. The corridor outside the conference room was quiet. Somewhere further down, a door opened and closed. Davin could hear, just barely, the sound of Mir in conversation with the night attendant, that decisive, slightly imperious tone that the 4-year-old used when discussing topics of importance, like yellow drawing tools. I'm an instructor, Davin said. I teach 11 to 13-year-olds how to collaborate across species. I'm not trained in early childhood welfare. I haven't, he stopped. I'm a single person with a faculty bunk on a station. Yes, Solith said. The conclave would place them with a family, a Veth family. That's the right environment. In 6 to 18 months, assuming a suitable match, which in this case, given the documentation status and the absence of surviving relatives, may lean toward the longer end. Solith folded his hands on the table. In the interim, they require a consistent care figure. The Academy can provide facility care. It has done this before. But facility care for 3 cubs who have already been through a significant relocation stress requires a stable anchor person, not a rotating staff assignment. You're asking me. I'm telling you what the situation is. Solith's pale eyes were direct. I'm asking whether you understand it. Davin looked at the table for a long moment. He thought about Keth watching the door in the dark, S's arms lifting toward him, the yellow drawing tools. He thought about what he knew and what he didn't. He didn't know the specifics of what had happened to them before the ship. He knew the shape of it from Ondav's careful summaries. Abandonment, displacement, a period of time that had required Keth, at 4.5 years old, to function as a protective adult for 2 smaller cubs, and the shape was enough. He didn't need the details to understand what the shape cost. They'd stay at the Academy, he said. In the Academy's care facility wing, which is residential, separated from the student dormitories, with full educational access and welfare support. You would maintain your instructor position. The care relationship would be official, conclave registered, with welfare office oversight, with clear timelines and expectations. And placement review begins immediately. Yes, and continues until a suitable long-term placement is confirmed. Solith paused. I want to be precise about what I am and am not offering, Instructor Kale. I'm not asking you to commit to a permanent arrangement. I am asking you to commit to being a consistent, registered care anchor for 3 cubs during a period of formal welfare review. That period has a defined beginning and a defined process. What it does not have is a defined end date, and I think you should hear that clearly. Davin was quiet. Outside, Mir's voice had gone lower, more conversational. He heard the attendant laugh at something. What does Keth think? He said. Solith tilted his head. That's not generally a criterion I know. What does Keth think? A pause. Solith's temple traces, faint but visible, shifted briefly to that pale green, the considering color. Then he said, Ondav's assessment is that Keth believes you are trustworthy, that this is a specific and considered belief, not a generalized one. Keth has, from what the welfare record shows, demonstrated considerable discernment about which adults are trustworthy. A pause. Keth's discernment has, in the period since arrival, apparently resolved in your favor. Davin looked at his hands. Then I'd be an idiot to argue with the discernment of someone who's that good at reading people. The care registration was filed at the end of the second week. The paperwork was extensive. He didn't complain about it. Ondev guided him through the conclave welfare forms and the Academy's internal registration, and the 3 separate identity documents that had to be filed, because none of the cubs had previous documentation, and the conclave system for generating emergency documentation for undocumented children had clearly been designed by a committee that had never been in a hurry. Essa's document came through first, then Mir's. Keth's took longest because Keth had somehow formed an opinion about the documentation process. The 4-year-old had grasped that a thing was being recorded about them, and had opinions about what should and should not be included. And Ondev had spent 40 minutes carefully explaining, through the interpreter, that the document was a good thing, and would help, and that the field for prior guardian information could remain blank, which it did. He moved from the faculty bunk to a larger room in the care facility wing. The room had 3 smaller adjoining ones, and he spent an afternoon with maintenance adding good latches to the interior connector doors, the kind you could secure from inside, which the cubs could work, because Keth had checked all the door mechanisms in the temporary residence within the first 24 hours, and Davin had noted this, and decided that control over doors was a meaningful thing. He put the yellow drawing tools in a cup on the communal table. He requested a reading cushion from Suite 7's inventory, the big one from the den, and put it in the common area of their quarters. Petra helped him carry it. She didn't say anything. She also didn't say anything when she noticed that he'd checked out 6 physical books from the Academy library, all of them with good illustrations, and lined them up on the low shelf near the reading cushion. "You've measured the shelf height," she said. "I measured it for the cushion." "Davin, the shelf is 31 centimeters off the floor." "It's a low shelf. I like low shelves." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know," she said, "when you came to this academy 6 years ago, you told me you'd stay for 2 years, learn the ropes, move on to something that made more institutional sense for your career trajectory. Teaching is good work." 6 years, Davin. He straightened the books on the shelf. The institution made sense. She left without saying anything else. But she helped him bring the reading cushion, and the next morning there was a small potted plant on the communal table, something green and manageable from the station's hydroponics bay, and when he asked her about it, she said she had no idea what he was talking about. The first night in the new quarters, Essa fell asleep on the reading cushion during the second book. Keth and Mir finished the book without her. Keth turned pages. Mir pointed at illustrations and made declarative statements about them in Veth standard that Davin could follow about 60% of, and when he couldn't follow the other 40, he made what he hoped were appropriate sounds of agreement, and Mir seemed satisfied. After the book was done, Keth looked at him. "Sleep," Davin said, making the gesture. "You can both go to your room." Keth looked at Essa, still sprawled on the cushion. "I'll carry her in a few minutes," Davin said. "She's okay where she is." Keth's temple lines were the pale green, considering. Then the cub stood up carefully and Mir stood up with it and they went to the connector door. Keth paused there. Turned back. Made a gesture Davin didn't recognize. A specific configuration of 2 fingers pressed briefly to the temple, then extended outward. He made a mental note to ask Ondev about it. Then they went through the door, and he heard the latch engage on the inside. He sat on the floor next to Essa and read the 3rd book to himself, quietly, because the room was nice when it was quiet, and Essa's breathing was even and slow, and the plant on the communal table was doing fine. He found out later that the two-finger gesture was an informal Veth expression, not a formal greeting, not something that made it into the cultural guides, the kind of thing passed between cubs and caretakers in family units. The closest human rendering Ondav told him was something like, "I see you. I'll see you in the morning." Months moved the way months do at institutions, faster than expected, marked by small accumulations. Essa learned to run. This was less a developmental milestone than an administrative crisis, because Essa running was Essa at full speed in any direction with complete conviction, and no particular regard for what was in the way. Davin got good at anticipating trajectories. He developed a specific vocabulary of alarm, a particular tone of Essa, left, that she responded to maybe 60% of the time and completely ignored the other 40, which he was told by the Academy's early childhood specialist was actually quite good for her developmental stage. Mir remained decisive about art supplies and added opinions about food, specifically about the seating arrangement at meals, which had to follow a specific configuration that only Mir fully understood. On the 3 occasions when it wasn't followed, Mir demonstrated an ability to project displeasure that was impressive in a person that small. Keth started asking questions. This was the thing that surprised him most. Keth had been in the early weeks economical with words, communicating what was necessary, processing what happened, watching. But around the 8-week mark, Keth began asking about things. How the food got to the station, how the lights worked, why the books had illustrations and the datapads didn't, and could they get datapads with illustrations, what Davin had done before he worked at the Academy. Whether humans slept differently than Veth. Keth had noticed, from the corridor, that Davin didn't wake up during the night cycles the way Keth did, and wanted to understand why. The questions came in batches, usually in the hour before sleep, usually from Keth sitting on the reading cushion with a book in its lap that it wasn't reading. Davin answered them. All of them. He learned to watch for the particular set of Keth's ears that meant a question was being prepared and to adjust his schedule accordingly. He told Keth about teaching, about the Academy when it had been smaller 9 years ago, before he'd arrived, back when the whole experiment was still considered risky by half the people who'd funded it. He told Keth about his own schooling, which had been on a much smaller station, much less diverse, much less interesting. He told Keth that the illustrations in physical books were there because someone had to make them by hand, which was slower and more expensive, and the datapads had algorithms instead of artists, and the reason physical books felt different was exactly that, because a person had chosen each line. Keth considered this at length. "You chose this," the cub said one evening, gesturing around at the room at Davin at the whole arrangement. "Yes," Davin said. "Why?" He thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest and manageable for a 4.5-year-old, who had very good calibration for when adults were not being fully truthful. "Because you're good," he said finally. "All 3 of you, and good things deserve good circumstances, and I happen to be here." Keth was quiet for a while, then happened. "That's the word, yes." "Things that happen," Keth said, in the careful way of someone working through a concept in a second language, "are not the same as things that are chosen." "Usually not," Davin agreed. "But you said you chose." "I did. So it wasn't an accident." "No," he said, "it wasn't an accident." Keth's temple lines went to the considering green. Then to something warmer, a color Davin had learned over the months, a color that was specific to Keth, that he hadn't seen on any other Veth in the building, that Ondav had told him was an individual expression, not a species standard, the way some people's faces did something particular when they were deeply satisfied that a thing had been confirmed. "Okay," Keth said, and went back to the book in its lap. The Welfare Placement Review convened at the 14-month mark. Harv Solith attended in person, which Davin hadn't expected. The session included ONDAV, the Academy's welfare office, a conclave family placement specialist who attended via relay, and a representative from the Academy's administration. Davin was asked to wait outside the main session while the formal assessment was presented, which he did, sitting in the corridor with the particular feeling of a person who has prepared as well as they can for something and is now past the point where preparation is useful. Keth appeared at the far end of the corridor 20 minutes in. The care wing's rules about unsupervised movement for cubs Keth's age, 5.5 now, allowed corridor access with check-ins, and Keth had, over the months, developed a detailed understanding of where check-in was and wasn't required and how to move between those zones with economy. Davin had learned to respect this. He watched Keth walk down the corridor with the deliberate, self-contained quality that was simply how Keth moved, and come to sit beside him against the wall. They sat in silence for a while. "Do you know what they're deciding?" Keth asked. "They're reviewing your placement status, whether you and Mir and Essa go somewhere else." "Do you want us to go somewhere else?" He looked at the cub beside him, 5.5, the temple trace at rest, the pale green of considering, the long fingers folded in its lap, the wrist that had healed crooked, the questions about how lights worked and why books had illustrations. "No," he said. "Then why are they deciding?" "Because the decision has to be reviewed properly. Because what I want isn't the only factor. Because you three deserve a process that's careful, not just whatever the closest available human happens to think." He paused. "And because, if it goes the way I think it might go, I want it to go that way through the right channels so it's real and it holds." Keth was quiet. "You think it goes the right way," the cub said. "I think it might." Keth nodded once, in the way of someone who has heard a qualified answer, and is choosing to accept the qualification rather than push for certainty. They sat together in the corridor until the door opened. Solith came out first. He looked at Davin, then at Keth. His expression was composed, but his temple trace was the warm amber of someone who has reached a conclusion they consider correct. "The placement review," he said, "has concluded that the current care arrangement meets the standard for long-term designation. There are additional documentation steps, and the welfare office will remain involved on a quarterly review schedule. The conclave's family placement search has been formally closed." He paused. "Congratulations, Instructor Kale," is the traditional thing to say at this point. Davin exhaled. Keth looked at Solith, looked at Davin, made the two-finger gesture, temple to extension, the one that meant, "I see you. I'll see you in the morning." Then the cub stood up, dusted off its knees with the brisk efficiency of someone who had things to do, and walked back down the corridor toward the care wing. After a moment, Davin heard Keth's voice, raised in the specific register the cub used when delivering important information, telling Mir and Essa something that he couldn't quite make out. Then Essa's voice, rising in that bright frequency she used when she was happy about something. Then Mir, the decisive one, issuing what was clearly a directive. Solith glanced at him. "What do you think Mir is saying?" Davin listened. "Probably something about the yellow drawing tools," he said. He stayed in the corridor a moment longer, listening to the three voices at the end of the hall, Keth's careful cadence, Essa's brightness, Mir's authority. And then he got up and walked toward them, because there were things to do and he had somewhere to be. The security team filed their incident report from the night of the alarm 11 days after the fact, as all non-critical incident reports were filed. It was brief and accurate. Unauthorized entry via crawlspace access, 3 Veth cubs, ages approximately 3 to 5, no threat identified. Situation resolved through de-escalation by Instructor Kale, Davin A. Faculty, Advanced Cooperation Seminar. Someone in the security office, Joss probably, though it was never confirmed, had added a single handwritten annotation to the final line of the physical copy. Situation resolved. No action required. Below that, in a different pen, 3 kids found a safe place. Mission accomplished. Davin found the copy in his faculty mailbox some months later. He taped it to the inside of the cabinet above the communal table, behind the plant. Below the low shelf, with the books with illustrations. In the room where, every evening, 3 cubs arranged themselves on a reading cushion and waited for whoever came through the door to bring the next chapter. He didn't miss it, he was always there. There was a student in his advanced cooperation seminar, a 13-year-old human girl named Delia, who had been at the academy for 2 years and was the kind of student who asked questions not to get answers, but to see what the question did to the person it landed on. She asked him, about 6 months after the incident report, whether he was the instructor who had found the cubs in Suite 7. He said yes. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "My dad says that kind of thing either changes a person or it doesn't. He says you can tell which." Your dad sounds observant. He works in welfare monitoring on the outer stations. He sees a lot of these situations. She paused. He says the ones it changes aren't the ones who make a big decision. He says it's the people who realize the decision was already made before they got there. Davin looked at her. "You're 13, he said. "My dad tells me a lot of things." "Your dad is right." She nodded, with the gravity of someone receiving confirmation of something she'd already believed, and went back to the cooperative problem-solving exercise on her workpad. He taught the rest of the session. Then he went back to the care wing, because it was nearly the hour when Keth asked questions and Essa needed to be discouraged from running directly into walls, and Mir would have opinions about the evening meal's seating configuration. He did not think of himself as a changed person. He thought of himself as a person who had been sitting in the right corridor at the right time and had, when something came down it, not moved out of the way. The Academy called this the fundamental principle of cooperative development. The space between two things is not empty. It is where everything happens. He'd taught that principle for 6 years. He finally understood what it meant. Essa turned 4 in the 3rd month, after the placement designation was finalized. Davin had not known exactly when her birthday was. The documentation process had included a best estimate birth date based on VETH developmental markers, and the welfare office had flagged it in his care calendar. He'd asked Keth about it, whether there were particular VETH traditions around birth anniversaries, and Keth had explained, in the careful, detailed way that Keth explained things that mattered, that the VETH tradition involved a specific type of gathered meal and a telling of the cubs' origin story, which was not the story of where they were born but the story of how they came to be known, who saw them, who claimed them, who recognized them as belonging to the world. "That's a beautiful tradition," Davin said. Keth considered. "You know the story." "I know part of it." "You know the part that matters." Keth paused. "In the tradition, the telling is done by the family." He sat with that for a moment. "Then I'll need to learn the rest of it well enough to tell it properly." They spent 3 evenings before the anniversary working on the telling together, Keth supplying the VETH structural framework, Davin rendering it into the shared language that all 3 cubs could follow. Mir had opinions about the order of certain elements and contributed, unprompted, a series of descriptive additions that were mostly accurate and somewhat embellished in ways that Davin suspected Mir felt improved the narrative. On the anniversary evening they sat on the reading cushion, all 4 of them, which was a tight fit and which Essa found enormously satisfying, and Davin told the story. The alarm in the dark, the yellow light in Suite 7, the 3 shapes in the den, the small hand extended palm down to test his palm. He told the part where Keth had watched through the night and then let go. He told Essa's part, which was simpler and more recent, and involved considerably more running than the other parts. Essa, in the way of 4-year-olds everywhere, had already heard this story in fragments and wanted to hear it again and asked questions at the wrong moments, and was largely undeterred by the narrative structure. When he got to the part about carrying her from the transport cart because the vibration made her cough, Essa looked at him with her wide, pale eyes and said, "You carried me." "Yes, because I was sick. Because you were sick, and I didn't want you to have to walk." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, with the simplicity of a 4-year-old pronouncing a conclusion, "You're ours." He looked at the three of them on the cushion. Keth's expression was neutral, but the temple trace was warm. Mir was nodding with an air of someone whose position had been formally confirmed. Essa was already moving on, reaching for the book on the nearby shelf with the good illustrations. "Yes," he said, "I am." Petra came to the birthday gathering. She brought the plan a companion, another green thing, slightly larger than the first, which she placed on the shelf because the first one looked lonely, which she said with a completely straight face and which he chose not to examine. She'd known him longer than anyone else at the academy. 6 years of adjacent offices, shared faculty events, the small mutual support system that develops between colleagues who both find administrative meetings exhausting and budget discussions grim. He trusted her judgment on most things, and on some things trusted her judgment more than his own. She sat with him after the cubs were in their rooms, in the quiet of the communal area with the 2 plants on the shelf, and the yellow drawing tools in the cup, and the low bookshelf with the books he'd measured for. "You look different," she said. "I haven't slept a full night since month 2. I probably look terrible." "Different is not the same as worse." She turned her tea in her hands. "You look like someone who knows where they are." He thought about that. He'd spent a lot of years moving through the academy, good work, meaningful work, but with the peripheral quality of someone passing through a significant place and not quite landing in it. Teaching was landing. The cooperative principle was landing. He'd known that intellectually for 6 years. "I know where I am," he confirmed. "Good." She set down her tea. "Mir told me today, for reference, that the seating arrangement tomorrow morning needs to change because the current configuration is. I didn't fully understand the Veth standard, but I believe the word was incorrect. The configuration is fine. Mir has an internal compass for tables, and it doesn't correspond to anything in the physical world. I think Mir's internal compass is more reliable than you're giving it credit for. Don't tell Mir that. We'll never eat at a normal table again." She laughed, and the sound of it moved through the quiet room like something comfortable, and the 2 plants sat on the shelf in the good light that the Academy's day cycle simulation provided, and from behind the connector doors came the sounds of 3 cubs settling, Essa's occasional small noises, Mir's decisive last comment about something, Keth's quiet. He sat with his colleague and listened to all of it. 2 years after the night of the alarm, the Academy commissioned a small retrospective exhibit for its 10th anniversary, 9 years of operation, the actual 10th, and the year leading up to it, which the administration decided was close enough. The exhibit was displayed in the main corridor near the entrance hall, where visitors and new families arriving for orientation would pass it. It included photographs and documents from the institution's history, student testimonials, outcome data, a timeline of significant moments. It also included in a section on unexpected outcomes and adaptive response, a brief case study drawn from the welfare office records. The case study was anonymized per standard practice, no names, no identifying details. It described a scenario, unauthorized entry by 3 Veth cubs, initial security response, de-escalation, welfare review, placement designation. The language was institutional and precise. The final line of the case study read, "Outcome, permanent care arrangement established. All 3 cubs enrolled in Academy Early Childhood Program. Follow-up welfare assessments at 6, 12, and 18 months, all rated as optimal." Davin walked past it every morning on his way to the seminar classroom. He'd read it the first day it went up and then stopped reading it, because it didn't really tell the story, and the story wasn't his to tell in a public exhibit anyway. The story was on a reading cushion every evening. The story was in the seating configuration at breakfast, and the yellow drawing tools in the cup, and the questions before sleep about how lights worked, and why books had illustrations. The story was in the latch on the interior connector doors, the kind the cubs could work from inside. The story was in Keth's temple trace going pale green, the considering color, and then something warmer, the individual color that Ondav had said was specific to Keth alone. The story was in S's arms going up. It was in Mir's certainty about the order of things. It was in the two-finger gesture, temple to extension, the informal one that wasn't in the cultural guides, the one that passed between cubs and caretakers in family units. I see you, I'll see you in the morning. He was always there in the morning. He planned to be there for a long time yet. The welfare officer's quarterly visit, at the 20-month mark, lasted 3 hours and produced a favorable report, and one moment that Davin thought about for some time afterward. Ondav was completing her documentation when Keth, 6 now, enrolled in the Academy's junior program, engaged in an ongoing and enthusiastic study of mechanical systems that had led to 2 unauthorized dismantlings of non-critical equipment, and a frank conversation about what non-critical meant and how to identify it, came to the doorway of the common area and looked at Ondav. You write things down about us, Keth said. Yes, Ondav said, to make sure you're well taken care of. And then people read them. The people responsible for your welfare, yes. Keth considered this. What do they do when they read them? They decide whether things are working well and whether anything needs to change. Things are working well, Keth said, with the directness of someone delivering a factual assessment. I agree, Ondav said. I'll write that down. Keth nodded, in the brisk way of someone whose position has been noted and can now return to other business. Then, you can also write that the seating configuration at breakfast needs to be revised. Mir has a proposal. I'll note that too, Ondav said with complete seriousness. Keth went back through the connector door. Ondav looked at Davin, he looked back. Things are working well, she confirmed. Yes, he said. She wrote it down. He didn't think of himself as remarkable. This was not false modesty. He genuinely held the view that what had happened was a matter of proximity and availability. He had been the person in the corridor, and he had not moved, and what followed from that was a series of small choices that added up to something. But the accumulation was in the choices, and not in some essential quality of the person making them. Keth disagreed. He'd said something like this once, carefully, in the evening question hour, had been trying to explain why anyone could have done what he'd done, why it wasn't special in the way that the retrospective exhibit implied, and Keth had listened all the way through and then said, many people were in corridors that night. Yes. Only one person sat down. He didn't have an answer for that. The choice, Keth said, with the deliberate quality that the cub brought to conclusions, is the person. You can't separate them. 6 years old. Davin Kale, who taught advanced cooperation seminar to 11 to 13-year-olds, and who had learned more about the subject's fundamentals in 26 months of evening question hours than in 6 years of teaching it, said, You're right. Keth's temple trace went to the warm color, the individual one. I know, said Keth, with the confidence of someone who has been right before and expects to be right again, and turned back to the mechanical diagram on the desk that Davin was, with some regularity, called upon to help interpret. The questions that followed were about torque distribution. He answered them as well as he could. The ones he couldn't answer, he wrote down so he could look them up. He'd gotten good at looking things up. The thing about the academy that took him longest to fully understand was that it existed in the space between two things. He'd known this intellectually from his first week. It was in every orientation document, every mission statement, every speech the director gave at the enrollment ceremonies for new students. The academy exists in the space between our species. The space is not empty. The space is where contact happens, where understanding grows, where the next generation learns to see across the distance. He'd taught the principle. He'd written seminar modules around it. He'd mediated arguments that were fundamentally arguments about who controlled the terms of that space, and whether the space was really shared, or just claimed by one side with a layer of diplomacy over the top. He understood it now differently. The space between two things is not a neutral zone. It's not a waiting room. It's not the pause between a question and its answer. It's where the most real things happen. The things that don't require an institutional framework because they precede the framework, and the framework, at its best, only catches up to document what already happened. What had happened was 3 cubs in a den of floor cushions. One of them had walked toward him. He had kept his hands still. Everything since then was the space between. Essa learned to read, Veth Standard first, then the Shared Academy Creole, then Human Standard, because Essa had decided that if books had illustrations someone had made by hand, then she wanted to be able to read all the books in every language. And this was an ambitious goal for a 4-turning 5-year-old, but ambition was not something Essa lacked. She brought books to him to be read aloud even after she could read them herself, and he understood that the reading aloud was not about the books. It was about the being beside. He read the books. Mir grew into opinions about the mechanical systems curriculum that Keth had pioneered, and then left the mechanical systems curriculum behind entirely to develop opinions about language, specifically about the gap between what words meant formally and what they meant in practice, which was, Davin observed, a remarkably sophisticated interest for a 5-year-old, and which probably said something about Mir's own history that he chose not to press on and waited to be told. Mir told him, eventually, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has decided a thing is safe to say, that on the ship, in the 3 weeks, the adults had used words that meant one thing formally and another thing in practice, and Mir had learned to read the gap, and the gap was where you knew whether to trust. He held that carefully, the way you hold information that has been offered at cost. In this place, he said, the gap is small. Mir looked at him for a long moment. I know, Mir said. I've been checking. Of course, Mir had been checking. He was not surprised. He was, in the way of someone who has come to expect that the people he lived with were consistently more than the world had yet given them credit for, simply confirmed in what he already knew. They were good, all 3 of them. They had always been good. The circumstances that had preceded their arrival had not made them otherwise, had made them careful, had made them watchful, had made Keth a reader of people and Mir a reader of gaps, and Essa a small bright force that ran at full speed toward whatever she had decided to trust. But it had not made them otherwise. He told Keth this once, in the evening question hour, in the way that things got said in that hour that didn't get said other places, that the thing he had understood, sitting on the floor of Suite 7 in the dark, was not that they needed saving. It was that they had already done most of the hard work. Keth had gotten them there. All he'd had to do was stay. Keth was quiet for a while. That's not nothing, the cub said finally. No, he agreed. It's not nothing. Staying is, Keth started again. Staying is the thing that's hard to be sure of whether someone will. A pause, you stayed. I stayed. Keth's temple trace moved through the colors in the way that Davin had come to read the way you read the weather. The amber of uncertainty, the steel blue of processing, the pale green of considering, and then the warm one, the individual one, the color with no name in any cultural guide because it belonged to Keth alone. We stayed too, Keth said. He looked at the cub. Yes, you did. So, Keth turned back to the book in its lap, a mechanical diagram, dense with annotation. It works both ways. He sat with that in the quiet of the room where the 2 plants grew on the shelf, and the yellow drawing tools were in the cup, and the connector door was latched from the inside in the way that meant the cubs had chosen to close it for the night, which meant they were comfortable, which meant that the choice had been theirs to make. Both ways. He'd taught cooperation seminars for 6 years, and the principle was in the name. Cooperation, the working together, the thing that required 2 parties to choose it, and he'd understood it the way you understand principles that haven't yet been tested in the specific weight of your own life. He understood it now in the specific weight. They had stayed. All 4 of them, in their different ways, had looked at the thing in front of them and not moved away. The Academy's mission statement called this the fundamental act, the recognition, across difference, that the space between is not a gap to be closed but a place to be inhabited, that you do not eliminate the distance, you stand in it together and make it into something that can hold the weight of people. He had taught that for 6 years. He had, in the past 26 months, learned what it felt like to live in it. The night cycle settled over the station. The light in the common area was warm. Through the connector door came the particular silence of 3 cubs asleep, the small sounds of breath and the occasional shift of a body finding a better position, and the deep quiet that meant they had, for tonight, let go of watchfulness and trusted the dark. He turned off the common area light, left his own door open, the way he had learned was necessary, so that if anyone woke in the night cycle the hallway would not be empty, and whoever looked out would see the light and know. He went to sleep. In the morning, as always, he was there.